Start the recording now. Hi, friends. Welcome. This is a new thing that we're doing. I'm really excited about. This is, we're talking about advanced personal statements. And my special guest today, and often, is Mr. Andy Simpson. He's here. And I'll introduce you more to, or I'll let him introduce himself in just a couple minutes to let you know context. Why are we doing this webinar? Andy and I have spent a lot of time. So we've known each other for about 17 years, maybe 16 years. And we've been geeking out on this stuff for about as long. Andy, he's worked with over, like 10,000 students on both in just the college prep process, whether it's college essays, test prep, et cetera. And he went to Stanford. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this. And one of the things that we did last year is we started to put together this choose your own adventure tool, which some of you know about. And it's this tool that basically helps students, guide them through the process. And we had all these advanced things that we were like, oh, we can't actually put this in the tool. Like, this is a little too crazy, meaning like they were only for the small percentage of students that we felt like really were like up to the challenge here. And so we decided not to put this in sort of like our main tool. We had all these things left over, and we hatched the idea we should do an advanced course. It kind of, coalesced with counselors and this is right around the time when I was leading my personal statement course for counselors last year, where a couple of folks who had taken the course were like, what else you got? Is there anything more advanced? And I was like, we do have some more things, stand by. So we put them together over Andy and I spent a lot of January and February just sitting in a room in my house and geeking out on college essays and coming up with examples. So this is a sampling of that. And we're going to lead this today, kind of like we're going to be leading the course. And the difference is going to be on the course, you're either going to get me or you're going to get Andy. And we'll tell you more about those logistics soon. But hopefully we're going to get a chance to actually unmute folks and like actually talk to each other. So Andy, would you be down to, with that intro, would you be down to just let folks know a little bit about you? And I've asked Andy to do it via his 21 details exercise, which he'll explain here. So Andy, take it away.
Sure. Hi, well, hope days are dancing along. Yeah, I'll share this. As far as I would imagine pretty much everybody, if you're here, these things that we like to play with. Top 10-ish values: laughter, adventure, adaptability, growth, specifically related to insight, or at least as much as I can find, travel, nature, curiosity, integrity, family, compassion, truth. And then these pieces, like when I was 16, I lived and worked on a dairy farm in New Zealand. I went through a ceremony, joined a Maori tribe. I love language. I think it's amazing. And I think it's also like completely not enough for what we actually need it for a lot of the time. Yeah, feel most home in the wilderness. I try to do as much wandering with my brothers and wife as possible. I generally love fairly dark humor, especially because I think that there's a way that playing with it leads to insight in some fun, cool ways. Yeah.
And tell folks what this is, like, because if they don't know what the 21 details exercise, like, what is it and how do we use this in the process?
I guess I'm kind of assuming that people would know this one since we feel like we advertise this one heavily. One of the big exercises we have students do is we ask them to kind of just make a list of 21 details. There's an exercise in the tool that's somewhat similar as far as kind of giving them kind of leading questions there. But we've found, so for example, like one of the essays, along the lines that Ethan mentioned, like one that we've never been comfortable like sharing broadly or with students because we worry that it's too good to the point that like we wouldn't want a student to read it and feel like, oh, well, I can't do that. I'm not getting into college. There was a student we were working with once who, if any of y'all know the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, it's this, I love that it exists, but it's this, a dictionary that a guy started where he felt like there were all these words that should exist that don't. Like there should be a word for the feeling of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. Like that things like that should have language around them. And so he decided to start a dictionary where he just created those words. He would pick a language that it feels like it should exist in, like, oh, that feels like a German word, and would create the word, create the definition. And a student we were working with once who, in her 21 details, mentioned loving language along those lines, and I just mentioned the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, and she was like, "Oh, I love that thing. That thing is so beautiful." And yeah, Ethan, and our eyes just kind of lit up, like, "Oh, well." And so we pointed out that like she could maybe play with that some as far as an essay goes, and she was like, "You're allowed to do that?" And we were like, "Yeah, you can do almost anything you want." And she built this beautiful essay creating. Her roots were Romanian, and so she built all these different words and defined them and used them to link to different aspects of her life in a way that was just kind of like both beautiful. I've showed it only to like a handful of students who it feels like they wouldn't look at it and be like, "Oh, that's just something that I can't do," and be disheartened by it. But in part, it's why we've been trying to figure out how to kind of play with presenting some of these things in a way that students who can kind of dive in and approach these things in this way can use and be effective with, but that also doesn't make students feel as though like, "Oh, this is just not something I'm capable of."
Right.
Because that would be a huge concern. And so these 21 details, we've often found students just interspersed in them end up tossing in like nice little nuggets that can kind of grow in fertile soil to oddly mix some symbols there.
Lovely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I want to pick up on the advanced thing. So part of what, just to set context before we jump into an example essay that kind of demonstrates one of these techniques, is what, when we're talking about an advanced personal statement, I think we mean it in a few ways. One is like, it's advanced in the sense of like, it's harder to pull off or it takes longer time. In some cases too, it's like, does the student have the appetite and energy for this kind of thing? Because not every student does. Some students want to write the essay and be done and move on and do other things in life. Can you blame them? No, not every student is going to want to just kind of, get in there and really dig deep. So what we'll say, yeah, go, please.
Like a lot of these students who were willing to put in, like 10 revisions, not necessarily every single one went through that many, but a lot of them did. Like it's students who were willing to put in that kind of time and work and make those.
And so again, I would just want to emphasize that the things that we're going to be talking about today in the next 45 minutes are not, we don't think this is for every student, and we don't even think this is necessarily quote unquote best. We just think that it's harder to do this. And these are in some ways, and you'll see the essays in a second, they are advanced, and the students who were, doing them were in some ways, prepared for a more advanced work. And what I'll say, like, just to kind of ping this for counselors is like, I think, these students, you meet them and you're like, whoa, and you kind of look at their resume and you're like, oh, interesting. Or they'll write a draft and you're like, this is pretty good. I don't really know where to take this, or I don't know where to go. It's like some of the things that we're going to be talking about today and in the course are going to be like, this is for those students. So the first technique that we want to talk about is, and this is one that, is kind of subtle. And by this, I mean, so we call this the late motif. Actually, before I say that, Andy, is there anything else you want to add about what makes a personal statement advanced, or do you think we've kind of covered it?
Yeah, I think that covers it. Like, I think generally it's that it's often, more complex structurally, or it's a variation on some structural stuff that we've covered before elsewhere in some ways. Yeah, more complex themes or threads, language. Yeah, I think that's cool. Good.
Great. So this first technique, the technique that we're going to talk about today is what we call the late motif or leitmotif technique. And you've heard of this, from but go back to English class in, 11th grade or 12th grade, and you hear this thing, and it's basically a theme or something that recurs. Oftentimes we hear this in music, right? Like a good example from this might be, a contemporary example might be something like the Jaws theme. Dun, 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 right? And every time you hear that thing in the movie, that the shark's coming, right? And of course, this predates Jaws, but it's that thing that comes back again and again. Now, when Andy and I were trying to name this particular thing that we saw appearing in essays, and by the way, Andy and I didn't like go to the mountaintop and like bring these down. We simply looked at past essays and we were like, well, what the heck is this student doing that's so awesome? And can we put it in a bucket and codify it and talk about how students get there? And we saw that some students were choosing some subtle theme or leitmotif, and they were bringing it in different places in their essay. Now, go ahead, please.
And to clarify, is that like if y'all know some of the other things we talked about as far as montage goes, is that it didn't fit any of those other kinds of approaches that we had talked about. It's like, well, it doesn't fit in any of these other boxes. How do we describe and codify this?
Right. Yeah, because we found like there were 7 techniques that we felt like were kind of, oh, these are pretty common to students, but this one didn't fit. And we saw that it was harder to do. So we dubbed it the late motif or light motif technique. And what it is a student chooses a thing and brings back that thing several points in their essay. So let me give you an example of this. And then I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read parts of it and you can kind of see how it works. And then we'll pause, we'll have a little conversation about it. And then we're going to transition. Andy's going to show an even more advanced example of this and talk about how that student got to the process. So got to that, the eventual. So an essay which didn't have the leitmotif. But notice how clearly the student establishes the theme at the start. Circles, triangles, hexagons, and circles. Can you hear me okay?
It's chopping up some.
Are we good?
I think your network's just hiccuping a little bit. Let it catch up for a second.
My network's having indigestion. Can you hear me now? How about now?
Cool. I think it's coming back.
Cool. Some people are saying it's fine now, so we'll proceed. All right, cool. Thanks for the feedback great. Okay, we're back. All right. So here's the essay: circles, triangles, hexagons, and squircles. I've always been a lover of shapes. Now, here it is, just clearly named. This is what the theme is going to be. Some visually aesthetic, others mathematically complex, and all mentally intriguing. Like my life is ranging from the culinary arts, robotics, dance, to editing film. Geometry has provided me a feeling of structure throughout my life, and I suppose I could say it has kept me in shape. So already we're getting some sense of like cleverness from the student, and we're signaling for the reader this is going to be a personal statement. Why? Because we've got this thing, it's providing me a feeling of structure throughout my life, so there's a hint that this is going to connect to other areas of my life. And so the student's doing 2 things really well. Number 1 is clearly establishing what the device is, or the leitmotif. And I think that's really important, especially with some of these more advanced techniques, for a student who wants to like give the reader rails. Now, if you don't do this, you have to have really, really good transitions, which Andy's going to talk to you about in the next example. And you also get the sense of like a question in our minds. It's like, okay, how is this going to relate to other areas of your life? As a visual learner, I grew up seeing objects as shapes. I recall staring at the construction workers who paved the entirety of my driveway with small bricks in awe of the precision of their arcs. The young, geometrically enlightened me would run around the house with a piece of string and a calculator as big as my face, measuring every circular object and calculating whether or not the ratio of the circumference to the diameter was truly 3.1415. Now, one thing that I want to point out as a lover of, and maybe you call me obsessed with values, is you can clearly see some of the students' values and what she's good at just based on this paragraph. And oh, by the way, it's connecting back to the central theme. So 2 things for the student to do in the second paragraph is, number 1, connect back to your theme, which is shapes. And number 2, give us some side of you. Now, what I mean by this is like when we're helping students brainstorm, we do something called the Islands of Personality exercise, which is like, what are the different sides of you want to show? And in this case, the student wanted to show her math side. And so math side of her is coming through, and again, connected back to the central theme. Every Chinese New Year, my family would gather around a DIY hot pot made from a yin-yang hot pot and a camping stove. Preparing for the grand feast was not easy. We split up the work. My brother set up the stove, my mom made the broth, my dad prepared the meat, and I diced my life away. Each ingredient had to be perfectly chopped to be a nice bite size, but not so small would disintegrate into the soup. We would tell stories and jokes while submerging cubes of taro and elliptical slices of lamb into the piping hot broth. Really nice, huh? Shapes had the power to unite my family and create connections to our homeland, despite being more than 6,000 miles away. Okay, now one of the things, and this is sort of where the essay levels up a little bit, is on a sort of basic version of this technique, the student could be like, could basically copy sort of the trend and repeat it here. And then it would be sort of actually kind of boring if the student just sort of repeated the the intro. It's a good way, not a good way to start. She's delaying the reveal of what are these shapes. Well done. How about now? Can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up when you can hear me.
The audio is better, your video is frozen, so I think it's still probably buffering some. Yeah. I'll toss something in here while audio catches up to that. Like
apparently it's
in my case at least.
It's bad still.
Maybe he's trying.
No, go for it.
Okay, like one thing with this, for example, that like, you know, with plenty of students, at least if we ask them like connect something like shapes and geometry to family, they'll just kind of stare blankly or not. Like you would have to walk them through to the point that it would feel like you are doing the work for them, which is something that I'm uncomfortable with to some degree, at least. So like that's something that tends to make this approach more advanced, is being able to build those connections between something fairly abstract like shapes and these different sides of ourselves. That's something that can be pretty tough to do for a lot of students. I would imagine you all have had that experience, at least, that you ask them like, okay, cool, so like how does this connect to these other sides of you? What does that mean to you? And they just kind of draw a blank, in part because we just, as a society, haven't asked them as often to think about and reflect and build those connections. So it's one of the things that tends to require a slightly more advanced student and thinker in many ways. Is Ethan back? Are you there?
Can you hear me okay?
I think so.
Okay, cool. I'm going to keep the video off, just hoping that improves our flow, as it were. But if it messes up again, just, I don't know, scream or something. Okay. So far we've established the theme clearly and raised a question. And the reason I'm going through this kind of meticulously is I want students, I mean, ultimately we're not in the business of like showing, here's this ridiculous essay, you can't do anything. The question is, how can you take this and learn from it and do a thing, right? So in this case, here's the theme, right? And I've raised a question. And then here's this math side of me that, oh, by the way, connects to shapes. And here's this connection to family that, oh, by the way, connects to shapes. You know, shapes had the power to unite my family and create connections to our homeland. So we've got math side, we've got family side. You can now start to see the sort of structure of it. And I'll read just one more paragraph. When I first started robotics, the creation process seemed complex, confusing, and even magical. And again, the student is kind of delaying the shapes thing, which creates a little internal sense of anticipation as we're reading the paragraph. But as the years went by, I realized that building a robot consisted of nothing more than the experimental manipulation of shapes. Ah, cool. And notice there's a variety now in when the shapes are coming in, right? Every week, my team would vandalize our whiteboards with messy drawings of chassis designs and intake systems. My knack for spatial thinking, so here's another quality that's coming in. Whoops. For spatial thinking allowed me to envision potential flaws in our design. Cantilevered wheels slowly become slanted over time, causing the robot to move in curves rather than lines. Asymmetrical weight distributions and a higher center of gravity would cause the robot to tip during deceleration. Together, we innovated in a small garage, eating home-baked cookies and microwaved quesadillas. Okay, so Jackie's making a great point. This is a point that I was gonna make earlier, that this is basically like a montage, right? That isn't this just like every other montage essay? And in some sense, that is true, because a montage essay, if you've been on any of my other courses, is basically choose a theme and connect it to different sides of you. One slight difference here is that oftentimes that montage thing, whatever the student chooses as their topic, is going to be something like a superpower, or a skill that they have, or it's going to be an essence object. So it's something concrete. The difference here is that this one is sometimes slightly more subtle and what I would term sort of like an abstract thing. So an abstract thing here being like a shape, or as in the example that Andy is going to show you in just a second, something like light. So it's sort of like it is a montage in the sense that there is a thematic connection, but there is something, somewhat abstract about it. So I'm going to zoom forward to the end here so you can kind of see how this one wraps up. She reveals these different sides of herself. And then here, biomedical engineering captivates me as it combines the set in stone rules of geometry with the artistic and creative side of innovation. I want to push the frontiers of cutting edge medicine while simultaneously feeding my passion for polygons. Now, does a student have to necessarily bring in their career at the end? No, but it can give it a nice, surprising, but inevitable conclusion. The world is made of shapes, and shapes can change the world. My life would be, as one could say, pointless if I could not utilize my love for lines and figures to make this green and blue sphere we call home a better place. A lovely bringing to close. So I want to just open this up for a question or two. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just those beautifully awful puns.
I want to just.
This person.
It really is lovely. As a super fan of dad jokes, I am all in. So I want to just open it up for questions, and let's see. Does anybody have a question or a comment on this essay? And let's just open it up for a second, and I will unmute you, so you can use the hand raising feature if you like here.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, do it. Hi, Patricia.
Hi, Ethan. I'm delighted that she circled back at the end to what she wants to do in her life, because I think I would have read a book and not had the last chapter had she not said what she wants to do in college and maybe going forward. So I was actually really happy about that part.
Yes, great. Yeah. Thank you. Others, feel free to unmute yourself. Just love to hear your thoughts or comments on this circles essay before we get into another one.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, go.
So what would be your recommendation? And I think the essay is wonderful. So what about if the student has supplements that ask, why do you want to study your intended major? You know, she spent a lot of time in the personal statement essay talking about what, you know, how she has this interest for robotics and engineering. So what direction would you recommend the student take to answer those essays so it's not repetitive?
Yeah, great question. I've got a quick thought on that, and then I want to hear your take, Andy. So my quick thought is like two paths. One path is it's okay that the student has briefly mentioned it, because then in that second essay, it's going to go a lot deeper into all of these moments that haven't been here yet. So it's like, so if we talk about this student in particular, there are probably other experiences, I'm guessing, you know, outside of school, internships, et cetera, that could be the first half of that why major essay. And then depending on what the other supplements are, the student could talk about how in college they want to extend that. The second option is that you've probably seen students do this. They'll write an alt ending that might just delete this paragraph, or they might, find some other thing that they can focus on. And for those schools that have a why major essay, they submit a different Common App version. So for most folks will know this, but you can, at least you could until this year. Hopefully you can still do it this year, because this will still make sense. But you can submit a Common App draft and then submit another Common App draft for another school. Andy, what are your thoughts?
I mean, like, I would say basically the exact same thing, that in part and ideally one thing we would spend time with them on before they even write this is looking at the different supplements they're going to have. Because if they're going to have a massive why major essay, then I'll want them to try to conserve some of those pieces, or at least to map out like what's going to go into that piece before they're writing this to some degree, just so that it doesn't feel like we paint ourselves into a corner too much. But yeah, that like I would think, in ways, one way that I've talked to students about it before is that they can kind of think of the personal statement, why major and why us, as separate parts of the same piece in many ways. That like if this one kind of drops little hints that set up biomed engineering, and then the why major gets maybe more technical, for example, since this one feels more about like personal connections and meaning, maybe that one gets into a little bit more technical detail about what they have done, what they're into, and why. And the why us kind of shows us that path forward, that all those pieces can come together in a really nice way.
Thank you.
Pam, what do you got?
I think the thing I face the most with kids when I'm helping them with their essays, and if it's even a value that they're going to potentially talk about or be kind of the theme, is that there's often some pushback, like, Miss Jose, that doesn't fit in, or they're like, Miss Jose, that's really pushing the boundaries too much and fitting it into the theme. And I'm always like, no, it makes sense. It sounds really great. And I'm curious if you guys run into that at all, also, where the kids are always like, no, that's you're pushing it too much.
Andy, go. Yeah,
to some degree. Like in part, I'm curious if like some of the bigger groups that I've worked with this year, for example, have an initial thought of like, it feels weird to even be writing something montage-ish. And I'll try to gently point out to them, like, the bigger weird thing is that, like, I think it's bizarre, and I've joked with students about this, that like, I think it's bizarre that we teach you to write one way for all of high school, and then we almost pull this bait and switch. It's like, okay, now totally different thing, go. But also that, like, in addition to that, we're giving them this thing where, at least they've all seen something that is more like chronological narrative, something like montage, where we're asking them to like link to these different sides of themselves. A lot of them is like, I have never seen somebody do this before. And yeah, I think that that's where some of that discomfort comes from. And so yeah, I'll try to kind of preempt that and dispel it early by pointing out that, like, I love if somebody can make those subtle connections between this thing and some seemingly disconnected side of ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. I love Carrie's comment that facing the strange often is a fabulous adventure, and again, students have to be down for that adventure and realize that, one of the things I'll say to them is like, look, your 4.0 is awesome. I'm super stoked on it. And I love that you got a 1500. Like, so did every other student who's applying to, this highly selective school. And if you're writing about engineering or whatever the thing is, like, chances are that the engineering essay is going to sound like this. Here are other students. And one of the things that we'll sometimes do is, like what Andy's saying, is just show them an awesome example essay. And you'll be like, this student also got in a highly selective school. I don't always tell them where the student got in because I don't want them to draw a direct connection. But, sometimes that can kind of unhook them or get them go, oh, this is possible.
Yeah, like one example I've given students before that I think makes it really concrete and clear to them is there was a summer program I worked in teaching a lot of college essay stuff once, where that summer there happened to be, I think it was 9 students named Paul Kim, who all had really similar grades and SAT scores, actually. And so I just pointed out, like, a lot of them were applying to the same schools, that literally on paper, a lot of that was going to look like the same person. And they were all very different people, like clearly from each other if you hung out with them even for 5 minutes, but that the essay was the way that they could differentiate themselves from each other in clear ways. And it feels like that, as an example, like a lot of kids I've seen, like a light flick, a little bit of like, oh, okay, got it. Like, here's why it's useful for me to explore and maybe lead into a little bit of like, how can I make some connections that other people maybe aren't making, or explore some stuff that they aren't. Yeah, it
Dorothy Maxine oh, sorry.
No, go.
One of the things Dorothy and Maxine are saying is that it's a great essay, and Suzanne, I promise I'm coming to you next, that it could be a more concise essay with fewer examples and greater depth. And this is going to be a thing that is sort of like, I think, giving students different example essays and showing them, hey, here's an essay that has 2 or 3 examples and goes in greater depth, and here's an essay that has 5 to 8 examples and is, goes wider. And so what I think is, like, if you have fewer examples, you go deeper, you have more room. If you have more examples, you go wider. And different students are going to have different preferences. You're going to have those maximalist students who just want to pack in as much as they can and go a little bit lighter. An example of this is an essay that I think is on our website, but it's like laptop stickers, different laptop stickers, each connect to a different side of me, and it stays kind of light. And then there's another essay where a student is writing about the objects on his desk, and he talks about 3 objects and goes into greater depth. So this is going to be a thing that I want students to see, where does their preference lie? And for some counselors, they're going to have a preference to go fewer examples, greater depth. And for some counselors, they're going to be like, you know what, let's go broader. It also depends, as someone mentioned earlier, on like what other supplements are you as a student working on, what other opportunities are available to them. Suzanne, go.
Thank you so much. I didn't know how to use my raise your hand. I have a much more fundamental question, which is, this essay to me is extraordinary, and it belongs in an arena that is thousands of miles away from the arena in which most of my students are hitting the ball. And so sort of, I'd love to use it as an example, but how do I show them that it's possible, to get fairly close? I mean, this blows my mind, this essay. It is so sophisticated. It shows such a comprehension of language and ideas and processing ideas and abstract concept. It's a gifted writer.
It might be breaking up. Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
How many students that you work with write like this?
A smaller portion.
Percent, 10 to 15%. I know that's hard to like kind of track, but I think that there are, 10 to 15% of students will like read and go, wow, yes, this is in the sort of this different arena that we're talking about. So part of what, and just the quick answer that I have for this is like, yeah, part of it is like pointing out, and this is a common criticism at college that I've been getting for like the last, 8 years, when I show these, even other essays that I think are less exceptional, is these are amazing essays. And I go, yes, but what can we learn from them? And so for this particular essay, I go, here's the thing that you're picking. Here are the 2 techniques for the opening paragraph that the student's using. Make sure it's clear and make sure a question is raised at the start. And then a simple outline of like, what is the value that you want to show in each of these paragraphs? And that's a thing that most students can do. Is like, oh, okay, I can show these different values. Now, in terms of the execution, yeah, only for me, 10% of students are going to get there, and maybe, fewer percentage sort of nationally or internationally are going to get there. But the sort of basic structure of it is pretty sound, and I think is pretty doable. At least that's my sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
To add on to that, in part, it's that like with even more advanced examples of some of these things, I probably wouldn't necessarily share it in a group setting. Unless I knew all the students and knew that it wasn't going to make some of them feel disheartened. That many of these are more like, if there's a student that I'm working with one-on-one who feels like, oh, you'll handle this, and you might even get excited by this. Because sometimes you just get a sense of like, oh, you're the kind of student who, like, if I show you this kind of thing, you're going to really get excited and be like, oh, I can dive in and explore. Like that's, so like being careful with how and where I share it in the first place is also something that I think is useful to keep in mind, especially like the super advanced ones.
Great. That's so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Thanks. I've got a question somewhat as a follow-up to that last one, focusing on one aspect of it. So in addition to this essay just being brilliant, it's brilliantly written and all the ideas are brilliant. But one of the things that's so striking is it's completely unique and it's unfakeable. That is, even a single line in there, anyone else would have to sit there and scratch their head to make up something like that if it weren't true. So I wonder if there's any lesson somehow that could be taken from this level of creativity that could still be applied to other essays, where maybe the person who writes it doesn't have the same experiences, not as talented, not as capable, etc., but that there's something about the authenticity that's very powerful. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about how that could be brought into even a less sophisticated essay. Thanks.
I love that idea. I want to open that up to see if anybody has a response to that beyond just us responding. Like other thoughts on what was just shared. And what I heard was, could this essay inspire other ways of thinking or creativity?
Do you mean from other students, or do you mean from teachers in the classroom preparing students how to?
No. I mean, that students who are not going to generate something like this automatically, but could still be encouraged to be very authentic and to really find ways to let aspects of themselves come through in a non-generic way, even if they can't quite express it like this or haven't had the full range of experiences or integrations. Hey, it's just a question. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
Really.
I love it. I love it as a question.
I get to
it's
work
making my brain go with like what other things as we raise the bar for students. So here's what is, go please, hop in. Go for it.
That was to me.
Valerie, go to you then. What are your thoughts?
Me? Did someone say Valerie?
I think so.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Yes, I love seeing this.
Yes, Valerie, go.
Hi, how are you? Working with students when we try to have our little workshops and things like that. This is the kind of thing that gives them that aha, because they come in just going, I don't even know how to begin. And so when you sort of using your values exercise and your object exercise, sometimes we can pull out a way for them to begin thinking about something like shapes or whatever it is, mountain climbing or whatever it is that's valuable to them, and how then they can kind of relate it to bigger issues in their life. So this is a great example for me of kind of how to move in that direction. So I love that. And I see students, when we are able to do that, kind of go, oh, wow, yes. And then they get so excited about their own essays.
Yeah. To my mind, it also, like, going back to specifically like the authenticity aspect of it, that like the beautiful puns there, like there's kind of like an embracing of self that I think a student has to dive into to be willing, like, because some students I think are going to like groan or just feel uncomfortable sharing something like a pun in the first place. Like there's something there as far as voice goes that is a tricky thing to point out, because I'm not saying like I want to make sure that a student doesn't think like, oh, I need to add puns, but that like that this student's voice feels really clear based on some of those things, like personality comes through there. And the reflections and the connections, like those feel really clear and authentic. And I think that is emulatable in some ways. It's more abstract for sure, but yeah, that like those are things I would point out as far as that a lot of this feels authentic because the student's taking the time to actually kind of like share things like personality, sense of like family of voice. And that I think, yeah, nudging students to, and this kind of relates to a question that was in the chat box a minute ago, but that like, in part, it's why I tend to warn students that like, I think every great personal statement that I've seen has gone through at least 5 drafts, and often way more than that, because it takes a ton of time to revise our way to those things.
Underscore the point that we are not saying on this webinar every essay should go through 5 to 10 drafts.
Yeah.
We're talking about when they do, here's what I've seen, and I'm aligned with Andy on this, that the really great ones, and this is for students who are not just, I think you have to have an appetite too to like make this not just about a college thing, but it's like becoming a better writer, creating something that's personally meaningful, that really feels like, this is a real expression of me, sort of beyond this college application process. Because I think when students are sometimes only thinking about it, for example, as a means to an end, meaning getting into college, then great. And that's going to yield a certain type of personal statement sometimes. And that's not, again, bad. It's just, sort of a different sort of perspective on this. And so again, this is for those students who have that appetite for doing something more. I want to get to Mary. I want to get to you, Andy. I don't think we're going to have time to get to the second example for this one, and because I think we'd be rushing it. Mary Whitcomb, you're on. What do you got?
I don't know
What are
if
your
this
thoughts?
is something that you can speak to, but I was wondering if you could tell us anything about the success that this student had in her applications.
Yes, it's been a while, so I don't have it, but like standing by with me. I remember that I think actually this student ended up reusing a portion of this, kind of surprisingly, and pieces of it for one of her UCs, but I don't have it. Sorry, I don't have it at hand. We do have it for the next essay, which maybe we could do this, Andy. Maybe we could do kind of like, maybe you could give us like a 2 to 3 minute tour of the next essay, and we can speak more specifically about where this student ended up.
Sure, yeah. Let me...
You want to share?
Yeah, I'll screen share and we'll
go for it.
Into it.
Hey, Ethan, somebody in the chat is saying that that essay was from a student of hers, just FYI.
Wow, amazing, awesome. Do you know then, Kate? Do you know? Will you tell us? That would be awesome. Awesome. Andy, go.
Okay. So this one, I'll just kind of briefly preview it and why I think this one, what I like with Late Motif is that this is a technique, and again, I think this is why this is possibly a more advanced approach, is that with this student, what we basically did, she was crazy smart, gifted in all kinds of different areas. And in essence, what I had her do was just write the strongest montage paragraphs she could without knowing how we were going to connect them, because she was high-level ballerina. So we wanted aspects of that. She also did robotics with family, like it was a family activity as a team. And then she did high-level like chemistry research. She wanted to get it into research on cancer. She had all these different pieces. And so what I had her do, and what I think this approach can be interesting, is that in essence, we wrote the strongest paragraphs we could, and we spent 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah, and so this takes a particular kind of student to my mind, because she has to be willing to kind of like muddle along and feel like we're going to find the thing that connects these things. And then eventually what popped is like, oh, it's light. Light can connect all these pieces. Because light is not one of those things that would have necessarily popped up on a brainstorming exercise. And we would have been like, oh yeah, light, great. That connects to 5 or 6 different sides of who I am in a clear way. So that this was something where she kind of did this in reverse, which I think is nice that like Late Motif allows for that more, because it tends to be an abstract thing. Like I did basically the same process with a student the same year, in fact, who used waves. And it was different kinds of waves connecting in different ways. But same kind of thing where, again, it's like, you know, finding a way in reverse to play with this. And then this one, I think, yeah, you can just kind of glance through as we go, but like that, in essence, I think this one is even a little bit more advanced than the one above. I do like that, like, my personal preference is more for like, yeah, thicker, like in-depth paragraphs. And I like that she did this some, but also that like each sentence here, notice that like, she doesn't really have much of an intro that sets up the thread. Yeah. That in essence, like, and it's why she ended, you know, first and second and paragraphs and started with this, so that after getting to this point as a reader, we have like, oh, okay, cool. I gotcha. I see what you're doing here. I know what connects these pieces. And then, yeah, like that conclusion, I think, is a pretty beautiful piece as far as like the symbolism that it gets into. And again, like, I don't know that that's something that all that many students we work with are capable of. And it's why, like, this is one that I will share with students, but somewhat rarely, because I worry about, like, I've definitely had, you know, workshops, for example, in which students get a little disheartened by some of the essays that they're reading if they're too high level, because they feel like, well, I don't think I can do that. So like, this is one that I've shared with students who it feels like this will inspire them in cool ways. But yeah, like in part, I guess, let me know if we want to read through any pieces of it more specifically. Yeah, can I make it larger on the screen? Sure.
I don't know that we'll have time to, I want to share with folks a little bit about the upcoming course. So I don't know we'll have time to get specifically into this essay, but maybe we could just look at that ending.
Yeah. So yeah, she gets into, you know, light connects, you know, ballet, robotics and family, chemistry research, you know, like Christmas time, and you know, making mole. And then, yeah, the conclusion, light will usually travel in a perfectly straight line, but if it comes in contact with something, it can bounce off it or bend around it, which is why people make shadows. The very innermost part of that shadow, the umbra, is where no light has bent around you. It's completely changed direction, bounced off. People are constantly changing and shaping the light around them and never notice. But in hindsight, I see it's the lights that have shaped me. It's kind of one of those endings where, like, I just have one of like, wow, I don't know that I would find that ending, like, because one thing that Ethan and I worry about is like, some of these students are sometimes better writers than we are. Like that final line, when she found it eventually, I was like, cool, you're set. Don't touch that piece. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So just real quick, I wanted to just share a little bit of like 2 minutes on the upcoming course, and then we'll do some more Q&A. And I'm just going to share my screen again. Here we go. So quick notes on it. we're doing this 4-week course coming up in not too long, starting the 22nd. And, you know, if you scroll down through it, actually, if you wouldn't mind actually just throwing the link in for folks, it's me and it's Andy. We have kind of like our older headshots here. But you can kind of see, if you look at, you'll be able to click on this and you'll be able to see the syllabus. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to cover each week a different of these techniques. So for example, the first week, we're going to cover something called the braiding technique, where students are taking two different things that seemingly don't go together and figuring out how do they go together. And it's for those, anytime you've had a moment with a student and they're like, should I choose this or should I choose that? And they're like, I don't know. And then somebody goes, could you try both? And it's figuring out how to smash those things together. And there's a little kind of step-by-step thing, a little exercise that can help students, one, recognize what those things are, and then, you know, and generate that list of what are the things that you could smash together. And then two, how do you actually smash them together? The next week, we'll talk about something called the Hegelian Dialectic technique, which is like, talk about one thing and then talk about the opposite of it. And then how do they synthesize, broadly speaking? And we've got a couple of example essays. And what we're going to do each week is this is obviously not long enough to like really, you know, dig into this. But what we're going to do is we've expanded it so that we'll have a 2-hour session with me, and we're going to have more conversation. And then there will be kind of like a weekly office hours with Andy. And so those are all mapped out right here. This is all on the landing page. We'll do sort of, you know, 2-hour sessions with me in between, you know, with Andy. And then we're going to do a follow-up session, you know, in a couple months, so that you can kind of try some of this stuff out and see how it's going with students, and come in and, you know, ask all the questions. So I'll just throw this in the chat box as well. Again, this is on the landing page, but I'll just throw it in there in case folks are interested. And then, yeah, this kind of walks you through it, and it gives you like the agenda for each one. So we do a check-in. We're also going to add, we're going to exercise that we haven't shared before. I have a rule that my friend learned at USC that hopefully you can still hear me okay. My internet will also be better because I won't be at the gates of Mordor. The brainstorm exercise that can generate 10 plus topics in 5 minutes. And I tried this exercise for myself recently and was able to generate 17 personal statement topics. And if you're like, well, you're a college essay guy, everything you think about is college essay related, but it's a pretty cool one to get students shaking them up. They're trying to come up with new ideas. So we're going to do, you know, the one that I was looking at are different as the way that their transitions function. You know, the transitions really had to be solid and on point with the Umbra essay that he was looking at. So we're going to explore in week 2, what are some great ways to help a student write a transition sentence. So that's sort of the long and short of it. Of the course, we'll share a link on that. So we'd love to have some of y'all. We hope some of y'all will join us. And we've got some hands still raised. So I'm going to go to Lori. What do you got? Lori Horn. If your hand is still raised and you're still interested in sharing anything, go for it. What are you thinking? Yeah.
Hi. I was interested in hearing about the kind of feedback that helps kids who write at this caliber grow their essays that you guys find yourselves giving.
Andy, go. I'd love to hear some of the questions. Andy's, I think, kind of an expert in this.
Say it again for me. I was responding to somebody in the chat box.
What is the kind of feedback that folks, that how do you give feedback to students like this who are capable of this to help them generate some of this stuff? Is that kind of it, Lori?
Not so much, though. I'm certainly interested in hearing that too, if other people would like to hear that. But I meant more, once they generate what they generate, how do you help them to grow their own personal statements to their next level of potential beyond that? Because every kid can go from point A to the next level with a little push, right? I think every child has the opportunity to go from wherever they are to revision and making it better. Even those kids who are at this high caliber have that opportunity when people are guiding them. So I was just wondering, in your experience, what kind of guidance you're able to offer kids who are writing at this high level when they enter the field.
Yeah, I think 2 things come to mind. One is that I think a big part of my job is in ways just knowing, like, in ways it connects to kind of like Dunning-Kruger, but like knowing what they don't know as far as what they're kind of allowed to do. So like with these kinds of things, for example, that like when, you know, if I show Umbra to a student, a pretty frequent reaction is like, wow, that's cool. Like I didn't know, or like with the Dictionary of Obscure Star Wars one, it's that like, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. And so that like, for a lot of students who feel, it seems like they're capable of that kind of writing, I think in ways it's kind of just like setting them up in the first place because they just don't know that they're allowed to do this kind of thing. Like there's a student we worked with last year who wrote this beautiful piece on memory and kind of like, I mean, it's it's hard to encapsulate because of like the abstract nature of like memory itself as a theme or a thread. But that like in part it was spending a few different sessions. And again, like I think some of this is my job is to kind of be able to figure out, are students going to be okay kind of muddling around a little bit? Because in essence, I had to tell them like, you know, because we were starting in like May, and I had to tell them like, we're going to spend a few weeks just exploring this thing, and I might just have you write paragraphs, and you won't know for sure how they're going to connect. And knowing that he would be okay with that, because he was like, okay, I know that like exploration will lead there and it'll get there. And then yeah, like in the writing process itself, I feel like one of my biggest jobs is to kind of keep asking complex questions that are essentially kind of like different versions of so what ultimately, but like getting them to kind of keep playing with connection and kind of like finding the balance between seeing where I think they could connect things, what it seems like my version of it would be, but like give them like semi-guiding leading questions. Yeah, I feel like with those advanced writers or advanced approaches, those are kind of like the two biggest things that come to mind as far as like setting the base for them to work from, so they're working at a higher level already, and then ways within it to keep like building and refining it.
Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes that's really, I mean, it's the permission giving thing. And then the sort of sense of like, how light of a touches do I give here? I was meeting with a student yesterday, and he's going to end up writing one of those bonkers essays. And right now, and what I said to him is like, I'm trying to figure out how to best to help you right now, because I don't want to like you to feel micromanaged. He's like, oh, I do not want to be micromanaged. And I was like, great. So what we ended up talking about is he just needed to know which, like he needed me to point and it'd be like this. And then, he ended up, we got to kind of in the session doing kind of a Frankensteining. But he essentially was like, he just needs someone to point and go in this, head in this direction, and sort of be that encouraging thing. And then many students are just need those like, and are going to and Andy's really good at this with asking big questions, which we don't have time to get into today, but sometimes really admire the way, Andy, that you'll put a question in there that will send a student sort of going, and for some students, that's not necessarily best, to ask them these huge questions on their paragraphs, because it's going to make them crazy. But for some students, it's like, yeah, that's the thing they need to go deeper in a particular paragraph, for example. Ben, what do you got?
Yeah, thank you. So somewhat, again, following up on this last question a little bit, I wonder if you have any suggestions on how far one can go in trying to quote unquote, help a student. I think it's, if you're really trying to get the student to produce the best essay possible, but you want it to be that person's work, I think there can be sort of a hard line to walk sometimes on what you can and can't say or suggest or even raise. And I just, it's partly a practical question, partly an ethical question, partly just, how to let the student express themselves. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to walk that and navigate those lines or those interfaces.
Great question. Andy, you want to go first?
Well, you actually, there was somebody, well, I'll just say, Tatum, will you message that to Ashley directly? I'm getting some people directly messaging me.
We got that.
It's cool.
If there's any questions that you have about this for the course and anything, just email them all to help@collegeessayguy.com.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah, will you repeat a little bit? I want to make sure that I'm answering the right question there.
Okay, great. I mean, I can go first. So what I hear, Ben, is like, what is that line between when we're helping a student and not just helping a student, but actually helping a student? Like, how do we not cross the line? And part of it is, like you said, practical question. Part of it is an ethical question. Like, where is that? And my quick thing on that is like, I feel like we're kind of all on this spectrum, Ben, and at different points, we're at different parts of the spectrum. And on this end of the spectrum, we have really, you know, they're the hands-on folks who really love to get in there and like lots of comments. And, you know, even further along, some people will go in and like, you know, say, write this instead, which I don't personally do, but some people will do that. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, which is like, you know what, very hands-off. Stephen Antonoff, for example, who some of us know, won't even like pick up a pen, won't even point it. He'll just give kind of general feedback on it, right? There's a more extreme version, like I won't look at the essay, and a more extreme version where folks, there are these writing services, as you know, that will write the essay for the student. So those are kind of the extreme examples. And I think at different points of the season with different students, we kind of go back and forth on the spectrum where sometimes it's the sort of light touches. I might, for example, start off with light touches and then kind of move more towards directive if I sense the student is wanting or needing it or asking for it, or, oh, it's October 30th and the student needs more directive feedback. Or there are also times when it's like October 30th and I'm, you know, maybe it's been more directive and now it's kind of like, you know what, this is your essay and you need to decide, right? So we just shift to this other side of the thing and it's like, I'm not going to get in there. And so I think we're kind of constantly, and if we were in a room together, and this was a session that I did at Heck a couple of years back, we actually placed ourselves on a spectrum of like, where are you generally on the spectrum? Are you more hands-on or are you more hands-off? And why, and have a conversation with the people next to you, and then talk with somebody who's on the opposite end of the spectrum to just see their perspective. So Ben, this is not directly answering your question about me personally, but what I'm trying to offer is like a larger framework for saying we are all at, I think, at different places and at different times and for different reasons. And if folks are curious, like on the spectrum of like super hands-on and super hands-off, I think I'm like not quite in the middle. I think I'm a little bit more directive than I think, like kind of generally speaking. But I think the part where it starts to feel icky and tread into like, is this ethical, is when it gets into that zone of like, is this too directive? And also, I'd like to talk to you about this for 2 hours. Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I tend to be, I don't know if hands-on is the right term, but it kind of linked to what I was saying before, that it feels like part of my job, and even this feels a little complex as far as the ethical questions around it, but that like in part helping them to understand what they're even allowed to do and helping them explore topics, themes that will be strongest for them. That like I'm more hands-on in that regard as far as kind of like helping them to kind of dive into like, well, maybe don't write about this stuff, you know, like if a student says, you know, I had this mission trip and I learned to be grateful, I'll more flat out tell them like, I would probably steer clear of that for X or Y reasons. Yeah. Whereas later, I try to get lighter later in the process. Yeah. Getting them to focus on kind of like eventually concision, but not at first. Yeah. And basically just kind of like asking questions that early on focus on things like clarity, if that's an issue that somebody has, like getting them to think big picture to small picture, as far as how they approach the process overall. Does that roughly answer the question?
Yeah, it's all helpful.
I mean, it's such a big question.
Yeah.
It's such a big question, Ben. I love the question. We're over time, but I want to spend a few more minutes just maybe we'll like one more question. It's such a big and such an important question, you know, as you know, I think for counselors in general, and I think for each person it's individual. And again, this is sort of listening to my spidey sense. And I will actually name it with students sometimes. I'll go, you know what? I have this really cool idea. And I'll actually, sometimes I'll say it and I'll be like, but I don't want you to, you know what? And then I'll just like shut up and I'll be like, you know, you'll hear me kind of like awkwardly go, because whenever I get this like a great idea about an essay, I have to like pause right there and go like, is this a thing that I need to share with the student or not? Is this my great idea that suddenly the student's going to feel like they're having to like try to, you know, make happen? And I think we have to be really careful. So I'd say like that's like it's a to be like that might be overextending. Like, is this the student's idea? And also it raises like, if we're helping a student pick their topic, that's getting in there of like, isn't that a much bigger, you know, meddling than just giving them sort of grammar tips and grammar advice? Some people would say, well, giving the grammar tips and giving those specific line writings, that's actually more overstepping. But I could really see the argument being made for giving students advice on what topics to choose is already a huge meddling. So I think generally speaking, I'm trying to offer resources. We're trying to teach techniques that are going to be useful, not only in this essay, but also in life. And so there's this other thing that's happening. But again, I'd love to talk more about this. Let's do one more, and then I know we're over, but I'm enjoying the questions and conversation. Actually, and also, if anybody else wants to step in, feel free to either put in the chat box, or if anybody wants to comment on that question, because it's such a huge one, like, the floor is open.
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one.
Some folks were just messaging. If you have any questions about the course and stuff, just email help@collegeessayguy.com, and Ashley's got you there. Yeah, so I got a direct message, someone saying, my goal is to always be sure the student's voice isn't lost. And that's such a tricky thing, right? That notion of voice. What I call voice is like, is the student writing sentences that not every student would write? Like, in other words, is there a thing that jumps out at me as like, oh, I haven't heard that before, or haven't heard it in quite that way? When I think concretely, specifically, because I think that if we tell students, for example, it should be in your voice, I just think that's terrible advice. And I want to do a session at NACAC about why you shouldn't talk to students about finding their authentic voice. I don't know, if I was a student and someone said, find your authentic voice, I would, at 17, what? What does that mean? It would totally freak me out, because that implies that there is an authentic voice for me. And I just think that that's crazy making. And I think it's actually, I don't want to say dangerous, but I think it's like, you know, my voice is still, my actual voice is still changing. Like, what does that actually mean? And so I think that there are many different voices. T.S. Eliot, you know, he do the police in different voices. There are different voices that we can use, but practically speaking, if you're going to use that, tell a student what it means, you know, in terms of their actual voice. For me, my version of that is like, are you writing sentences that other students aren't writing? You know, and you can point to specific things. And sometimes I think we're talking about things that are like a little bit funny or a little bit ironic. Like oftentimes when people are saying, oh, I can really hear the student's voice, there's some little element of irony. At least that's a common theme that I've seen. Yeah. I'm getting some more direct messages. Y'all can feel free to check the everyone button for other folks to see. Show, don't tell. We're going to leave it off on show, don't tell from Anne. Andy, you want to take this one? Can you talk more about show, don't tell?
Sure. I actually tend to, I really try to stress to students that I think show, don't tell is a little off for personal statements. I like joking with them. Like, I think college essay writing for most students is more like kindergarten. It's show and tell. That, like, I think most, just because it's so easy for a lot of students to think they're showing and to be super unclear and to not communicate anything, basically. So like a lot of the essays that I like using examples that I think are more accessible to like most students will get into nice illustrative details, but then we'll often like directly name, like, here's this value that shaped in me, and here's why that matters. That, like, to my mind, I tend to err on that side. And then if it feels like a student is more advanced as a writer and is capable of getting into some complexity and subtlety, we'll fine tune it from there. Maybe I'll talk them through like, okay, so this, you could make this lesson notes or experiment with these pieces in these ways to kind of see what you want to kind of leave subtle or not. But both because of how quickly those essays are often being read and how easy it is. Like, I would love to hear for y'all. I think in my experience, like the biggest problem students run into is, and I think this is not just students, I think this is basically universal as far as writing goes, that it's so easy to assume that what I wrote will mean what I think it means in somebody else's brain. Yeah, that like, it's so easy to just assume that like, oh, they'll get what I meant when most of it stayed in my head. And it feels like, especially in bigger like workshop settings, a big part of my job in some ways is to point out that like, that's the most common problem in the world. Like, I'll often joke about it in a way where their teacher or counselor and I are pointing out that like, we have done this all the time, just so they feel like we're not pointing out something that they're doing wrong that nobody else is. That like, this is virtually universal, and it's one of the biggest things they need to learn as far as writing goes, is how to make sure they're really clearly communicating what they actually think they're communicating. And so, yeah, like yeah, that's the kind of a longer version, I guess, of like, I like show and tell a little bit more, just to make sure for most students that like, I worry more that they're not going to be clear at all, rather than are they like getting beautifully illustrative?
Yeah. One simple way to do this with students is to just pause the session. If you sense that the student isn't quite getting the difference between show versus tell, there could be some steps missing. And one thing I'll do is I'll just do like a quick 5-minute side mini lesson on show versus tell, and actually have the student try and identify it in a paragraph. So just grab a paragraph from an essay and go, okay, where is the student showing and where is the student telling? And I've got a few different example essays of this that I love, and when they're showing, what are they showing? So let's look at this particular sentence and what's the underneath. So one way I'll talk about it too is like, there's the stuff that's on the surface, the show, and then the tell is usually the values. So what values are being revealed, and have the student, like, we'll just kind of like mark it up together. Great. And then I'll also show them paragraphs where the student has actually told the value, like named the word curiosity and then expanded on it. So the student has told first and then shown it through examples, because I think both can work. So students will ask, should you show first or then tell? Should you tell first? Both can work. And I think it's good for them to see examples of both. And I think that it's also good for them to see, here are examples. The show is so clear, we don't actually need the tell. And that's kind of like the sweet spot when we're just like, yes, you didn't even need to explain to me. You can even cut that last sentence because it's so clear. But other students, again, kind of put them on a spectrum. Other students will have that preference of like, I want it to be super clear because I believe my reader is skimming. And if they're writing for the UCs, then yes, tell, make sure that those clear values are coming through. Tell. If you want to show a little bit, great, but that's bonus points. But you really got to bring in, and we could talk for a long time about the UCs, but what is the information that the reader is getting? So the other thing is sort of like, I put it on a spectrum, like information to poetry. If you're writing for the University of California schools, we got to be over here, information. If we're in here, poetry, and it's like a pretty thing that it doesn't connect to the 13 points of comprehensive review, sorry. What's going to get more information? It's going to differentiate that student from other students at their school. For the personal statement, I can also tell a student, I think we're kind of in here in the abstract range. I'd like to get a little more information. And what I mean there is like values. And so sometimes that's going to mean bringing in a little more tell, because it's like the essays maybe all show and there's no like, there. So the values aren't clear maybe. Okay, we've gone way over. Part of it, I was just, excited. And part of it is, we just got a lot to share. So that's why we're on the course I'm doing 2-hour sessions, because in the past course that I did this winter, these hour-and-a-half sessions would often go long and people would stay in the Zoom room and just chat. But I hope that you had fun, and we'll send out a recording, of course, and more info on the course. Love to hang out with y'all. I know it's getting into season for some of us, but for those of you who can join us, we'd love to have you, and we'll geek out a little bit on some college essay stuff. Thanks, friends, and we'll see you real soon.
Wow.